Osiris.
He didn't really kill his mother. He silenced his mother.
Right.
From his point of view, he had to. From his point of view, he was being tortured and tormented and beaten into the ground by this voice that he needed to silence. And it was encouraged to by the voice in his head. You've got to kill me.
Welcome to Discograffiti, the music obsessives podcast that gives freaks like you and me the chance to connect with a brotherhood obsessed with rating the entire discography of every single artist and band that ever mattered. I'm your host, Dave Gebrow, and with 3 new episodes each week, you're going to gain a comprehensive knowledge of an act's history and output in the time it takes to listen to one album. Now that we're 2.25 years into our existence, I am thrilled to announce that we have partnered with the podcast network Osiris Media, the leading storyteller in music. You can check out all their music podcasts at osirispod.com. And in this episode, we'll be turning our spray cans on possibly the greatest drummer who ever lived, Jim Gordon, along with our very special guest, author and Jim Gordon biographer, Joel Selvin. Coming up, we've got Robert Schneider rating the Strawberry Alarm Clock, an interview with Phil Manzanera from Roxy Music, Kula Shaker, the Lemon Twigs, and the 3 surviving Diedrich siblings rating everything they ever released as one of the greatest bands of all time, bar none, The Free Design. Oh, and Michelle Phillips, along with Mamas and Papas biographer Richard Campbell, rating everything they ever did. So don't miss out. Open up your listening app right now and subscribe. And away we go then. Welcome to the rise and fall of Jim Gordon, with an appended foreword by Joel Selvin, author of Diversion Books' brand new publication, Drums and Demons, The Tragic Journey of Jim Gordon. Joel, I missed the living shit out of you, man.
Well, good to be back.
You didn't say it back to me, and that hurts, but I'll take it and move on. All right, before we focus squarely on you and your masterwork, I had initially invited you back, or at least to rerun the episode when the book comes out. And I figured I would make this episode like a second printing of a book. So append the 2 parts together, because the first episode, The Rise, got more listens, which is odd considering the salaciousness of the public mind. I figured The Fall would be the one that got more listens. And then just like a book, stick a foreword on the front of it to bring us up to date. Before I explain to the audience circumstantially how the episode was recorded, tell me, Joel, is this the greatest book ever written? Be honest.
It is probably the best book I've written. Every book you write, you learn lessons and you apply on the next one. But really, I think this is the most incredible story that I've ever latched on to. So much of the glory of this book is Jim and the power of Jim's story.
The funny thing is, when we started the prior episode, you ceded all the credit for the oral history of Sly and the Family Stone to the members of Sly and the Family Stone, which is understandable because it's an oral history. But now you're repeating history. You got to take some credit for this one.
Dave, I wrote a good sentence or 2 in there, but really the book rises or falls on the story. You know, I once won an award for a magazine article I did about Merle Haggard, and I called Merle up and I said, you know, I won this award, but really the honor goes through me to the subject of the article. And Merle said, I see what you mean, but it occurs to me that there are people all over the country writing articles about me and not winning awards.
There you go. There's the self-congratulatory remark I was looking for. You deserve it. You really do. I mean, your Altamont book, which I talk about in the episode, it hit me so hard. You know, most of the book has stayed with me. And what stayed with me were the images that you painted. So, I mean, that's what lingers in the mind. And the circumstances behind the recording ended up on the editing room floor because I figured nobody would want to hear it. But now it feels relevant because this is the most popular show in Discograffiti history. Is
that right?
As of this morning, there's been a total of 8,766 listens.
Yippee-ki-yo-ki-yay.
Motherfucker. So it feels relevant then to say that when we recorded it, that morning, it was maybe 2 hours before you and I spoke. I had had a hemorrhoidectomy, which is an unsexy word to say, I realize. Forgive me for saying it because I got to go through this story. You don't know what happened afterwards. And that's where things really fucking went crazy. So that morning, I was in my bathtub. I know you know what I'm talking about with regards to the bathtub because during Watergate, you were doing the same thing. I was holding my wife's hand, screaming and crying. And she said, you got to call Joel and you got to postpone it. And I said, no fucking way. This is Jim Gordon and Joel Selvin. It's not happening. So I took a boatload of opiates to be able to, and I found one position laying down on my couch where I wasn't in agonizing pain. So when you listen to the most popular episode in the fucking show's history, I'm in so much pain and I'm so high on, I can't remember if it was Dilaudid or whatever it was, it doesn't matter. And then 2 days later, I came very close to bleeding to death. They brought me to the hospital. The operation backfired. I bled out in my bathtub and they got me to the hospital just in the nick of time before I died. And I felt like I was being pulled away.
The fatal hemorrhoid? My God, man, that's really something.
It was crazy. So that was 2 days after the initial recording of the episode. And so life is just nuts. The fact that that could become the number one episode, going through all that shit, life's fucking crazy. Enough about my experience. The rest of this is going to be about you and the book. Tell me about the publication, any new news happening on the Jim front. Talk to me.
Yeah, as a matter of fact, there is. Copies of the book are out and circulating, and among the people who have read the book and reported back to me is his daughter. And that was incredibly gratifying to hear from her. She's an extremely private person. She was severely traumatized by her grandmother's death and spent many, many long years absolutely out of touch with her father. About 10 years ago, she became interested in taking care of him and establish a conservatorship. I don't think she's ever been in touch with him, like visiting him or anything like that. But she read the book and there's family history in there she knew nothing of. And she was extremely grateful. And likewise, Mike Post also read the book. He's the TV theme show guy, but he and Jim started out in the music business together. They were in their first band together. And Mike is Jim's daughter's godfather, and he remains very close to Jim's ex-wife. And he told me that it had changed his mind about his life, that he had beaten himself up, was his phrase, over not being able to help Jim. And reading the book, he came to understand that he could not have helped Jim. So that, I'll wait with some amusement to read the book reviews and stuff, but I'm done. Mike Post says it changed his viewpoint on his best friend, and daughter said that it was revelatory to her. And well, wow, you can't expect your writing to do anything more than that.
Yeah, that's pretty amazing. So it's Diversion Books that are handling it. Do they have a specific plan for the publication in terms of a rollout? I would imagine.
So book publishing companies all have marketing departments and make efforts to get the book out there. There's something like 50,000 books published every year in this country, but I've never left it to the book companies to do my marketing for me.
Well, you could talk about the number of books, but this is the most fascinating story in rock history, I believe. Jim, especially because of the precipitous heights and the deep, dark valley, there's nothing that really can approach it. So if you're thinking outside the box, I don't think you'll have any trouble connecting with the avid reader.
Well, the story has never been told. There was a Rolling Stone article, and there was a subsequent interview with Jim in prison by the Washington Post after Layla won a belated Grammy. But neither of them have the story. The lurid headline of Jim killing his mother just was the blast that covered up everything. And nobody looked back after that. They all looked away. So the years and years of torment, the psychological treatment, the residential treatment programs, the struggle with sobriety and his relationship to the recovery community, all those things just weren't part of the story. But Jim spent, like 8 years of his life in a daily battle with evil forces inside his head. And if it came to this horrible conclusion, it was a long way and a torturous pathway to get there. So that's what the book lays out that has never been told before. And I think from what people are telling me, that I have been able to make this account passionate enough that people actually see into Jim's troubled heart. And that's what I hoped for them to do. Somebody said the other day they read the book and they wanted to know if it was all right to feel sorry for Jim. And I thought I did my job.
Yeah, you did, because you came at me with a very empathetic attitude. And, the things that I said, to your credit, you would kind of hew towards a different way of thinking so that the understanding of what command schizophrenia is could be conveyed to the audience. And I believe that above and beyond the work that we did together being a great episode, I think one of the reasons why it was so enormously popular is because I also marketed it to the true crime community. Because I think if you're just going to go music on this, you're going to lose a lot of people that you would have had.
Well, that's sort of the genesis of the book, actually. The Jim Gordon story had been in my head for a long time, but I hadn't really acted on it. It was at the suggestion of an editor in New York that I'd done a few books with. He said, Joel, your next book, you should try and mix crime and rock and roll. I took that as an invitation and thought, well, what's the most famous crime in rock and roll? It's Jim Gordon, I'm afraid. But there's so much more to it than Jim's crime. He's not just his disease. Yeah, it really is an important book because of the content about mental illness. This culture just averts its gaze. And schizophrenia, and I'm sure I mentioned this in the other edition, turns out to be incredibly common. 1 in 100 in the general population. That's 1%. Now, by comparison, multiple sclerosis is 1 in 10,000.
Wow, that's pretty prevalent. I would not have thought it was that many people.
You get into the big cities in this country, and there's tens of thousands. 80% of them are drug addicts, and 80% of them are mentally ill. And the mentally ill are almost all schizophrenics. So you see those people sleeping under freeway overpasses, their heads are buzzing with voices.
I know Bob Mosley from the Moby Grape, I believe, had a similar, definitely.
Skip Spence, Brian Wilson, Peter Green of Fleetwood Mac.
Danny Kerwin.
Also, yeah. No, it's very prevalent in all our society, and musicians aren't exempt.
Yeah, they're probably more liable because they're swimming in those waters to be able to pull inspiration.
If you start thinking about, well, where did this almost supernatural talent at dividing time and playing percussion come from? And you realize that it's probably rooted in the same electrochemical setup in his brain where the disease came from. And then furthermore, when he played drums, the disease went away. The report of the drum, when you hit a drum, you feel it in every cell in your body. It's not like playing a trumpet. And the rhythmic entrainment of the mighty groove, very hypnotic. I believe that once he was at the drums, that was what filled his consciousness, and it drove the voices out and made him safe and secure and be able to master his world, which he couldn't when he stopped playing drums. And Dave, let's contemplate the whole spiritual nature of the drums, the ancient history of this instrument and its role in all of mankind, marching, dancing, hypnosis, all kinds of roles like that. And then in the 20th century, the very American development of the 4-piece drum kit with the cymbals and hi-hats, and that's really important because that was the instrument that was really introduced in the 30s. And it was largely designed by the most famous drummer of the time, Gene Krupa. And that instrument, that 4-piece drum set, became the kind of standard kit of the modern world. And that is the instrument that Jim mastered.
He definitely did. And there's no one that provides that propulsive forward locomotion that Jim does. I know your go-to is to think of You're So Vain, but to me, I think of Only You Know and I Know and that runaway train feel.
Which one? The Dave Mason or the Delaney and Bonnie?
Delaney and Bonnie.
Oh, man, that is a fantastic instrumental track. Yeah, that is unbelievable. But yeah, the paradiddle part just picks that track up and drives it. And then he goes into the break where he doesn't play and the whole track just falls apart and then boom, he picks it up again. Yeah, that's brilliant. But then a month or so later, he does the same song with Dave Mason, and it's a completely different rhythm pattern, totally different song, and also brilliant.
It is. And, some of your stories, I mean, if you haven't heard this episode, if you're returning to it, great. And I've fused them both together. It's going to be a long listen. This episode's going to be over 2 hours, and all of it's going to be fascinating. I'm not cutting anything from either episode because, some people listen to the first part, they drop off. You got to hear the whole thing. It's staggeringly astounding, this whole tale. We'll kind of leave it here, except with, I just want to know what you've moved on to, because I know when your work is done here, just like when I edit the episodes and move on, I release them, I'm already weeks ahead of where the episode is. Where are you now? You're not really in Jim Gordon territory.
Oh, most completely. The book is just about to come out. I'm doing as much as I can with it. And yeah, there's a next project that's starting up in that sort of infancy. I'm going down next week to meet with songwriter Barry Mann.
Oh, wow.
He wants to do a book and I want to help him.
Not quite as much dirt there.
Oh, no, it's a happy story. It's a love story. It's a beautiful thing. That was one of the questions they asked when they were interviewing me for the job. It's like, geez, I mean, you write all these downbeat, dark things. Could you do a love story? I said, I'd love to do a love story.
I mean, so, all these things like the Speed and Bad Wine from Altamont, the PCP from Sly, the coke and heroin and the familial murder in Jim. Was there any transference of the darkness? Do you feel like enough of that, it's making me feel like I need to take 5 showers a day? Is that why the love story?
Oh, no. The opportunity to work with Barry Mann presented itself. I think he's probably the greatest living songwriter. And I just jumped at that. I gravitate on my own toward the dark stories. I can't do the psychoanalysis for you here, but that is how I see life, that, there are no happy endings and light is more interesting when there's shadows, all that kind of stuff. I mean, the history of art and literature is that evil is much more fascinating than good. But people want me to help them work on their book, whether it's Sammy Hagar or an Ed Hardy, the tattoo artist. I'm delighted to do that because now all I have to do is do it well enough that they like it. I'm no longer the final arbiter, and that's good because I torture myself over these books. Linda Ronstadt told me, man, she's a perfectionist and she just can't stand her records because all she can hear is the places where she could have been better. But this is not true when she's working with other singers like Emmylou Harris and Dolly Parton. She says that's a different thing. And then if the other two gals like it, then I'm fine with it.
Relief. Yeah, it's a relief. In my personal experience, a lot of the best work I've ever done didn't have that heavy albatross import of, I got to do something great here, because it was a tossed off afterthought. And so because of that, it became great.
Then you're like the jazz musician who lives in the moment, right?
Speaking of that, like the Joe Pass records from the mid 60s, where he kind of sold out and did like the Stones Go Jazz and things like that. Those are my favorite Joe Pass records. I don't like Virtuoso as much as I like the ones with the cheesy background singers. There's something of the duality in there of a serious player jerking off into a black hole that is endlessly fascinating to me.
You see the picture of Joe Pass and Jim in the book?
Yeah.
That's a very rare picture of Jim Gordon smiling.
So the book came out February 26th, and I'll tell you flat out, anyone listening to the show, you got to get the book. I don't push anything on anyone. I could give a flying fuck. I'm telling you, if you're listening to the show, that you will love the book and that Joel Selvin, for my money, is the greatest living rock scribe there is. And this
man,
really,
the check's in the mail, Dave.
I'm not kidding, man. I always talk from a place of passion. You know that. I connect with what you do 1,000%. And speaking of jerking off into a black hole, keep doing that, please, for us.
Dave, thanks for your time and enthusiasm. Appreciate it a lot.
Action!
And now, an important message from Don Bowles.
Dan Kapelovitz is the only candidate for District Attorney of Los Angeles who has over a decade of experience successfully defending those falsely accused of crimes. Dan Kapelovitz is the only candidate running for Los Angeles District Attorney who is dedicated to ending mass incarceration. Dan Kapelovitz is the only candidate for Los Angeles District Attorney who co-created and produced the televised freak-out public access show known as The Three Geniuses, which the LA Weekly dubbed the most intentionally psychedelic show on television. Dan Kapelovitz is the only candidate for Los Angeles District Attorney who is an accomplished photothereminist. Dan Kapelovitz is the only candidate for Los Angeles District Attorney who now has a record label with punk rock legend and all-around weirdo Don Bowles. Dan Kapelovitz is the only candidate running for Los Angeles District Attorney who was not only the features editor at Hustler magazine, but also Larry Flint's editorial point man for his First Amendment lawsuit against the military-industrial complex and the Pentagon. If you believe in liberty, justice, and the American way, vote for Dan Kapelovitz. Stick it to the man. Vote for Dan. Dan Kapelovitz.
I'm Dan Kapelovitz, and I approve this message.
And away we go then with Joel Selvin as we race through the stark cubist mental state of the talented and tragically troubled Jim Gordon. All-American apple pie young man, perfectly on beat both behind the kit and in his day-to-day, turned, well, schizophrenically induced matricidal murderer. Tonight's guest literally wrote the book on Jim Gordon. It comes out in February, and I can't wait to crack it open and sniff down its floridly scented contents. This guy had a legendary column in the San Francisco Chronicle that ran from 1972 to 2009, in addition to books on Ricky Nelson, Ed Hardy, The Grateful Dead, and the #1 New York Times bestseller, Red, My Uncensored Life in Rock with Sammy Hagar. Not to mention 2 books of his that I've read and can vouch for because they're mind blowers. Altamont, The Rolling Stones, The Hells Angels, and The Inside Story of Rock's Darkest Day, which is an essential companion to Gimme Shelter, and Sly and the Family Stone, An Oral History, which is as good a compendium of pages as I've read in a while. The man's doing the Lord's work, yet he's taking time out to do a Drum Pounders Deluxe deep dive. Give this badass scribe a bit of your love, because he surely deserves it. Lads and ladies, Joel Selvin.
My.
Come on, every intro of Joel Selvin should be that exclamatory, no?
You know, whatever. Just pass the peas.
I will say that your Sly and the Family Stone book, it really fucked me up. I mean, you know, after I was done reading that, I was a Sly fan from the start, and I was always of the mind. From when I was a teenager, I read Mystery Train, and I read the Sly chapter over and over and over again at 14 years old. And I'm thinking, from Small Talk on, it sounds like it's all garbage. And then I heard it for myself, and I was like, with each preceding one, no, this guy remained a genius throughout his whole life. It wasn't like it's all as good as Riot, but the story that history perceives is incorrect. And I actually started to attempt to make a documentary about Sly, and then actually wrote a fiction feature, because I'm a filmmaker, that is kind of based on what he went through with PCP and 824 Bel Air Road, 832,
Something like that.
I've scaled that fucking wall and just sat up there and looked at the premises. You're a great writer, and your excitement about music, it really comes across. So this book is a big deal for me, as it should be for everyone else.
The Sly Stone book that you speak so highly of, I think we should note, is an oral history. And the fact is that that book really belongs to the people who told me their stories. Their accounts are so vivid and so lucid and so candid that they really deserve the credit here. I was the guy that channeled them and that edited the transcripts.
But the assemblage is masterful, because you probably wound up with a fuckload of stuff. And so to whittle that down in a way that's consumable
I don't know how much was on the cutting room floor. I used all the good stuff. There were heroes in that project like Hamp Banks that I can't credit enough. But I'm with you on the Sly Stone book. It's truly a remarkable piece of work. And I feel comfortable saying that, given that, my role is kind of facilitator of that book.
That brings up a really interesting point, because if you just did oral histories, you could go around saying, I just wrote the greatest book, and you won't be considered an asshole because it's everyone else that wrote it, right?
I had the opportunity to talk over the oral history deal right about the time I was working on the Sly. I can't remember whether I just finished it or was just about to start it, but right there with George Plimpton.
Oh, wow.
And that's the man who knows about the oral history. And he recommended the Thomas Hauser book on Muhammad Ali. And I don't know if you've read that or are aware of it, but it is absolutely, without question, the textbook oral history. And what greater story in our lifetime to tell than the life of Muhammad Ali.
Sure.
Yeah, Plimpton was very helpful and really happy to get under the hood and talk about the whole mechanics of it and why it works. And then later I had the opportunity to tackle the Sly Stone story insofar as the album Riot Going On for Mojo magazine, using the same quotes from the interviews that I had done for the book.
You talking about the Dick Cavett Show article?
Yeah, that's in there, yeah.
Okay, so that article, it's probably the greatest article I've ever read in Mojo magazine. It's so insane. I've read it so many times, and when I did the 3-part episode of Sly at the beginning of our gestation, I repurchased that magazine. I had to track it down in France and buy a copy.
2001, who can forget the date?
You know what I was doing when 9/11 happened? I was listening to Ain't But the One Way.
I was going to say, I tackled this for Mojo magazine, and I felt that my efforts, they were sufficient. They weren't insufficient, but they didn't match the power of hearing it strictly from the voices of the people. That goes back to Dance to the Music, though, doesn't it? Listen to the voices.
Right. And I could go down this rabbit hole with you for the next 2 hours, but of course we have to take a sharp left here, because I want to talk with you about another obsession of yours. You obviously are a Jewish man with a darkness, just like myself, or else there's no way we'd be on this Zoom call with each other. Tell me about this darkness in yourself that doesn't allow you to listen to acts like Katrina and the Waves and just suffice with the sunshine.
I'm okay with, happy face music, but there's no story there.
Right.
And I'm a writer. My stock and trade is stories. I do gravitate toward the dark stories, the noir, Burt Burns and the Gangsters, Sly Stone and his criminal friends, Altamont and the Hells Angels, even Hollywood Eden, which is my book about the origins of the Los Angeles pop music scene. It kind of, skirts toward the dark side of things. So I like shadowy pastels. What can I say?
How long of an obsession, I'm going to guess it's an obsession, have you had with Jim Gordon? And when did you know this was a book that you were going to do?
I first stumbled to the idea of this being a book about 1994, when I made an initial sort of run at doing something with this after I'd written Summer of Love. It wasn't going to be, but I sort of put it on a shelf and let it just sit there. And I picked it back up about a little over 3 years ago.
Okay.
Deep storage.
And, I know you didn't actually get to, I don't know how I got through to Jim. And of course, this is like 10 years ago, but I tracked him down. At first, he didn't take my call. Then we just had a brief conversation where I said, is this Jim Gordon, the drummer? And he said, that was a long time ago. It wasn't much more than that. I wish I could say it was, an endless conversation. But, I'm so crazed over this guy's work and his story that I wound up tracking down Renee Armand, his ex-wife, and getting to know her. And she, as you know, is a lovely, delightful person. So, I'm hoping that far from this episode or episodes putting this obsession to bed, giving it context or maybe helping make sense of it all a little bit with you. You're actually, even though you're the biographer, through this whole process of the last few weeks, you've been trying to keep me under control. Like, dude, let's not talk about every last thing he ever did. Let's keep a vice-like grip on the narrative, shall we?
I'm come from the newspaper world. The best advice I ever got about writing a newspaper article came from the managing editor, Gordon Pates, who told me that he didn't consider a sports story worth a shit unless you knew the final score by the end of the first paragraph.
Right. Toward that way of thinking, this is not a completist trek. Even though this is a completist show, if we did a completist thing on Jim Gordon, we would alienate 99.5% of the audience.
Let me show you something, Dave. I have right here. Okay.
Oh, shit. So you're holding up a pile of pages.
Those are union contracts. Each one of these is a recording session that Jim Gordon played on. It lists the studio, the hours, the producer, the name of the songs, all the other people who are playing on the session, their addresses, their social security numbers. And this is about, half of Jim's union career. All the non-union dates are not reflected with union contracts, but I'm holding up a stack of like 3 or 4 inches?
Yeah.
I think there's about 1,000 contracts in here.
That's crazy.
And each one of them, 3 or 4 songs.
Right.
So you're looking at Jim playing on 3,000 songs here.
Yeah, that's insane. So Joel, you and I will do a year-by-year thing. And in fact, I've compartmentalized every year, kind of naming each year, like here's what happened in his career, mainly like from 65 to 79. So we're going to highlight certain songs and records which feel crucial in telling the tale so that you get a full sense of the scope of how much Jim Gordon accomplished in his 20 years as a professional drummer.
I think it's 15 years.
15 years?
Oh, yeah. He starts in 1963. And he's done in 78.
Well, 79, right?
You're really, if the stuff he did in 79, 80, and 81, it's nothing. It doesn't even count.
His drum solo as Animal, to me, is the epilogue of his career. It is the epilogue. So I consider 79 because of that. But we could duke it out later.
He's playing on a cartoon. Give me a break, That's a long way from a Streisand session.
It is, but it's the first Muppet movie. It counts. All right. So I want the audience to feel what it's like to get caught up in and run over by the locomotive thing that is the Jim Gordon style. So toward that end, I want to, actually keep an eye on the pacing and move quick. Jim's life, to me, when I look over all his work and everything, it feels like the final scene in Goodfellas. And of course, 2 of the songs in that final scene, Jim's on. And so I would love to convey that sort of breathlessness. All right, so here's the run-up, what I endearingly call the section that gets us to the first ever thing he did. So Jim was raised in the San Fernando Valley of LA, went to Grant High School. His mother, Osa, was a nurse. Dad was an accountant. What's his dad's name?
John, but he was known as Jack.
So he was an accountant who I'm guessing instilled in Gordon that sort of all-American, keeping track of every last expenditure in his date book sort of methodology of living.
Jack was an alcoholic who was a very problematic father up until when Jim was about 13 years old when his father entered Alcoholics Anonymous. He had an older brother, about 2 years older than him, and they were raised in a highly repressive, buttoned-down, middle-class house in what was at the time a very leafy suburb of Hollywood. It was not the San Fernando Valley that we've come to know. It was the San Fernando Valley in the 50s, where there were plenty of empty lots and persimmon groves, and, it's just a different world.
Is there any inkling at all that there's going to be any kind of psychological issues with Jim at this early stage?
You never can put your finger on where that sort of stuff begins. But the evidence is that Jim lived in his own head to a great degree beginning in childhood. And where that blooms into some kind of psychotic behavior, it's really hard to say. A lot of the struggles were interior. They were just in Jim's head, and he lived with them all by himself. And we can't really know until they emerge in action. In deeds, and you say, look, that guy's crazy. You don't know how long he's been battling those forces and how long it's been brewing inside his own mind.
Right. I know as far as his proclivity towards keeping a beat, that he made his first set of drums out of garbage cans, and then his parents bought him a real set soon after that. In high school, he worked whatever gigs he could get, weddings, bar mitzvahs, parties. And then his first band was Frankie Knight and the Jesters, and they played the Hollywood club circuit and began to attract attention, which is what brought the Everly Brothers sniffing, right?
Yeah, Frankie Knight and the Jesters did a lot of Hollywood gigs. It was his high school friend, Mike Post, who would eventually become famous for writing TV theme songs, who brought Jim into the band. And then Joey Page, the bass player and musical director of the Everly Brothers, saw the band and instantly recognized 17-year-old Jim Gordon.
The Everly Brothers were getting ready for a summer tour in England around 63, and they wanted Gordon to be their drummer. His parents disapproved. The pay wasn't very high, and he actually passed up a music scholarship to UCLA in order to begin doing this. Is that right?
He had been thinking about going to college and becoming a music teacher. His girlfriend was doing chorus line dancing in casinos in Reno and Las Vegas. And so she'd started her show business career.
Jill
Habibe? Yeah, something like that. And the Everly Brothers thing just sort of came out of nowhere, and it would have been irresistible to Jim. The Everly Brothers at that time were pretty much the last rock and roll act from the 50s that was still standing. They were one of the legitimate certified greats of the era. So yeah, that was an incredible launching pad for Jim, and his parents would not allow him to take the job unless he agreed to go to college. And there was scholarships on the table from both UCLA and Valley State, and he did sign up for Valley State. I don't know if there was a scholarship involved, but I mean, it was a state college, and it's not like there was a huge tuition or anything. And that lasted not a full semester. The summer tour was of the U.S. It was a pretty grueling, long tour. And then in September, just after he started school, they went to England. And there they were on a tour with Bo Diddley, Little Richard, and a group out of London that had never played outside of London, had a small record up in the mid-charts called the Rolling Stones. They were the opening act.
Nice.
So when he got back from England in October of 63, he dropped out of college and devoted himself to being a professional musician full time.
What was his flashpoint moment of creative epiphany? Did he have anything that happened to him or an experience where he was like, this is it?
He was in a marching band called the Robin Hood Band, which had 75 members. They wore green tunics and pointy hats, and they were sponsored by the International Order of Foresters, Rose Bowl Parade, public events, that kind of stuff. And that was him at age 15, having already gotten all the training and book learning. He was adept at sight reading. He'd been taking Bach homework on the marimba from a UCLA professor. He studied with Cubby O'Brien's dad, and this Robin Hood Band, apparently, which is where he met Jill, his girlfriend, that sealed his ambition to become a professional musician.
Okay. Which leads us into the first phase of his career, which I'm going to affectionately call Skippy, 1963 to 69. And this is, of course, Frank Zappa's nickname for him because he was such an all-American boy. He notated every last cent that he spent, kept track of everything, was tidy as can be. It's like the crazy person is always cleaning up their house, thinking that that's going to solve everything. All right, so he's traveling England with the Everly Brothers, and in 64, he marries Jill. What's interesting about the marriage to Jill is right as his career takes off, that's when the marriage ends. It's almost like when you lay all the events of his life out, that just the gesture of he and Jill breaking up was what let some of the forces of those voices in. Of course, it's easy to say from afar, but literally she's gone, and then Delaney and Bonnie, right?
Yeah, and I don't see it quite the same way. To me, he'd already had an incredible career. He'd played on numerous big hit records. He'd been in sessions with the biggest names of the industry at that point. He'd played all over Good Vibrations and Wichita Lineman and Classical Gas and on and on and on. What then happened at the time that he broke up with his wife was that he had experienced so much success, and he felt constrained by his domestic situation. He wanted to spend some of the capital, and that's where these live bands came in. And he started with Delaney and Bonnie. He hadn't really been on the bandstand outside of a few dates with Chad and Jeremy, of all things, since the Everly Brothers.
I don't want to get into Delaney and Bonnie quite yet because we haven't even started with Dino, Desi, and Billy.
Well, the Delaney and Bonnie thing, the whole period of his career where he became a live performing musician belonging to bands, that's like a second act.
So in 1965, I call this year Jim Gets His Feet Wet. Outside of the Everly Brothers, and by the way, this is the very first time where the guest has provided the playlist, which I really appreciate. It's an awesome playlist. It's like 4 hours long. I've got a place in Vermont, so when I drive from Jersey to Vermont, it's literally the exact amount of time to get there. The whole thing kicks off with Love is Strange by the Everly Brothers, and with that loping beat and sort of relaxed cowpoke saunter, it's not the Jim that we come to know in a few years. So this is my favorite version of this song. This is a great song. I love it. And the Dino Desi and Billy from that year, I'm a Fool. Not quite sure if he's on the whole record or not, but I'm a Fool is like a bubblegum pop Louie Louie redux.
I think Jim's drumming on I'm a Fool is the beginning of where he starts rewriting the way studio drums are played. It's embedded in the composition. It's not timekeeping. It goes into the chorus. It comes out of the verse. He's got all kinds of little controlled explosions, and all his intuition, all this brilliant imaginative intuition is very much there.
Yeah.
And to me, a lot of this stuff that Jim does and why his playing is so unique and so different from anybody else's is because of the electrochemical setup in his brain. And we know that that's going to become disturbed and staticky as he gets older. But I'm convinced that the original vision that he had of how drums worked was a product of that.
I mean, there's an aspect, if you can get the timing right, then you have control. And when he wasn't pounding the skins, it sounds like he didn't have very much control at all. So I can see the appeal for sure. And probably the most positive thing to happen to him was Hal Blaine getting extremely busy in the mid-60s because all the overspills started going to Jim. Isn't that right?
Al gave Jim a lot of work. Mike Post got Jim a lot of work. Lee Hazelwood got Jim a lot of work. As soon as people heard Jim, they wanted him to play on their records. He just had that kind of incandescent appeal, and nobody had ever heard anybody play drums like that.
Go ahead, I'm sorry.
1965 is the beginning of him playing sessions. 1966, I mean, he was arm in arm on par with Earl Palmer and Hal Blaine at that point. The records he played on in 66 are just phenomenal.
It's crazy. I mean, at this point, it's still super early in his career, and he is pushing his way to the front of the pop ranks. The most remarkable has got to be I'm Waiting for the Day on Pet Sounds. I mean, he's a year into his studio drumming career, and he's on one of the greatest records of all time, very front and center, too. He's also...
How about Orange Juice Bottles on God Only Knows?
Right.
I'm Waiting for the Day. The timpani is Gary Coleman, a very well-known Hollywood session musician. But that's Jim on the kit, and the timpani and the kit just explode that track. But Hal was behind the kit, as he usually was at Beach Boys sessions when they started cutting God Only Knows, and Jim was on additional percussion. And that's where he razor-bladed open plastic orange juice bottles and tuned them. And clip, clop, clip, clop, clip, clop, orange juice bottles. You put that track up and listen to it now. You'll hear those orange juice bottles. They follow Hal Blaine's drum part, and they light up the track. So Brian Wilson, right? Orange juice bottles.
But Caroline No, they're very front and center in Caroline No. Those same bottles.
I'm not aware of Jim being on Caroline No, but I haven't seen the contract for that.
Maybe he's not. But we know that Brian Wilson's predilection for citrus and for California orange art from that time. So it's no surprise he gravitated toward that as percussion. River Deep Mountain High, is that him on the kit?
No, that's Earl Palmer on the kit. He's shaking bells. There were about 30 musicians on that track.
I mean, that song is completely insane. It's amazing he's on it. I think one of the most underrated things...
After a Beach Boys session.
Nuts.
I mean, the guy was on one wonderful record after another. He played on a bunch of incredible Merle Haggard sessions, and then the next day was playing on Glenn Campbell's Gentle on My Mind. I mean, it just goes on and on.
His country career is kind of interesting, or sideline, I should say. So in 66, it was Merle Haggard's The Bottle Let Me Down. And then in 67, I'm a Lonesome Fugitive. How much country did Jim partake in? Because this early, more relaxed work of his is actually a really super appealing sideline corollary of his career.
Yeah, he loved playing jazz too. So like the Mel Torme sessions and stuff like that was stuff he liked. I don't know how much country he did, as much as there was a call for. But Merle Haggard was a particular client. Merle was just about 2 chart records into his career, 2 or 3, when they decided to bring in James Burton and Glenn Campbell on guitar. And it was Burton who said, let's bring Jim Gordon in with us. And at that point, Merle pretty much adopted Gordon, and Jim's on just so many of the great Merle Haggard records. That's him on Mama Tried. That's him on the Jimmy Rogers stuff. But that's true of Campbell, too, by the way. Campbell played tons of Merle Haggard sessions. And get this, he's singing harmony on Today I Started Loving You Again. Glenn Campbell. He's on Dance, Dance, Dance by the Beach Boys, Strangers in the Night by Frank Sinatra, and the Merle Haggard, Today I Started Loving You Again. These guys were making so much music, so much different kinds of music, and they were all enthusiastic about it. It wasn't like these were Nashville guys looking down their nose at rock and roll, or New York guys looking down their nose at R&B. They were young, and they were open to the possibilities of everything. It was very California scene. And my God, I mean, the records that they were turning out, Nancy Sinatra, Sonny and Cher, all the Phil Spector stuff, all the Beach Boys stuff, Jan and Dean, Glenn Campbell, all the folk rock stuff. I mean, it just exploded in creativity. And these same musicians were playing on everything, whether it's Harry Nilsson or the Byrds.
Yeah. I mean, I had Don Randy on too, and talking about the scope of what he did too is equally nuts. So in 67...
harpsichord on the Stone Ponies' Different Drum,
right.
which Jim's on drums. And he said that after that, he got all the harpsichord calls.
Yeah, that's right. That's right. Kind of like Al Cooper after Like a Rolling Stone. The first time he ever played the organ, all of a sudden he's the go-to guy. So in 67, his career really takes off. He's on a rich variety of staggeringly diverse pop songs. The Beat Goes On, Gary Puckett's Woman, Woman, Gentle on My Mind, which I believe was supposed to only be a demo, but it turned out to be an absolutely perfect demo, which was followed up in 68 by Wichita Lineman. Did he play the entirety of the Beau Brummels Triangle?
Yeah, there's no other drummer on that record.
Okay, that's
and by the way, John Peterson, the Beau Brummels drummer, who had left the Beau Brummels to join Harper's Bazaar, he didn't play on those tracks either. Jim did.
Okay.
Yeah, Lenny Warnaker, the record producer, he didn't go into the studio for years without Jim.
Triangle is an absolute masterpiece, way up there for me for Jim in 67. Different Drum is a great example of Jim sublimating that locomotive thing he does to the majesty of that perfect Nesmith top line. The melody's great. He doesn't take over the song. He can lay back in the pocket, but he does it in an inimitable way. Then Song Cycle by Van Dyke Parks, and later Discover America, and Gene Clark with the Gosden Brothers. These are classic records, one after the other, 2 to 3 dates a day, 6 days a week, right?
Yeah, pulling down huge money. 21 years old, making more money than his parents combined, working all the time except Sunday. And his wife has now landed a job on TV dancing for this Dick Clark show called Where the Action Is. And so she's out 6 days a week dancing on location where the show was shot. Dancing on Sand's apparently a bitch, and she said you got sunburned a lot. I mean, this is all the beginnings of a cultural explosion emanating from Southern California that rolled out in the mid-60s, 64, 65, and then just blew up behind the Byrds and Buffalo Springfield and Johnny Rivers, of all things, Mamas and Papas. Suddenly, what had been a very small, remote outpost on the faraway West Coast was now, with London, the global center of the pop music world.
Yeah. You mentioned the Byrds. I think one of his first releases is 68 is unquestionably one of my favorite records of all time, and objectively the greatest Byrds record. Notorious Byrd Brothers is absolutely perfect. And is that him just on Wasn't Born to Follow?
No, it's him on Going Back with that slam into the final chorus. I think he's all over it. They brought Hal Blaine in for like one track because Jim was too busy. But yeah, they fired Michael Clark during the sessions. He'd been their drummer since the very beginning.
And you can hear, by the way, on a bonus track at the end, him getting kicked out of the band, basically.
Yeah, they reported a lot of that stuff. But Jim was just fit in just perfectly to that, and that record was finished. They fired Crosby like a couple weeks later, and the record was finished by, these Hollywood session musicians.
Well, Gene Clark was in there for a blip, too.
I don't know who was all on the whole thing, but I know they brought Paul Beaver in, and he was the early guy on the Moog synthesizer. synthesizer. They had a steel guitar player in there. They had a harpist. They didn't know what they were doing. They were just throwing stuff against the wall to see what stuck.
Born Out of Chaos is the absolute... I was 14 years old in high school, and I was writing the Notorious Bird Brothers on the cover of my Trapper Keeper. No one had any idea what the fuck I was talking about at that time. This is the 1980s. Nobody gave a shit about that. All right, so in 68, we've got Notorious Bird Brothers, Buffalo Springfield's Expecting to Fly, which there's some weird time signature stuff in there. Even though I always try to keep time with Jim, for decades now, I've never been able to successfully do it. Tiptoe Through the Tulips by Tiny Tim, Classical Gas, Dream a Little Dream of Me, Who Knows Where the Time Goes, Harry Nilsson's Everybody's Talking, which, I mean, just that breezy shuffle alone, you could have a whole episode about. And then the staggering Grazing in the Grass by the Friends of Distinction, which is a true stunner. And you want to talk complex. That's a complex song to play.
Yeah, he's slamming right from the downbeat on that one. And every note was charted out in advance. And he had to find his own sort of place in the chart. It's kind of brilliant. But the power of that track it's just explosive. And of course, that's King Arison on congas that he and Jim would later combine on the Incredible Bongo Band, too. So that was kind of significant. And by 1967, the Hollywood session players had just developed into some unreal level of virtuosity, and their values were to serve, to elaborate, to embellish. They weren't there to be in the center of the frame. They were there to lift other people up. And so, just look at the people you rattled off. I mean, here's Jim. He's doing a Gary Puckett session with 26 musicians one day. Next day, he's doing a Merle Haggard session, right?
I feel like the most significant thing that he did in 68, I could be wrong about this in terms of how I assessed it. I think since he hit the big time and became this master session musician, that the City is the first band that he joined. Is that correct?
I think those were just sessions. Did they ever gig?
I don't think so. I
don't think so. No, his picture's not on the cover. It's just the three guys. Carol and the two guys. And I think he was just a session drummer. He plays some demos for Tapestry later that year, but he's not on the master tracks.
The City's fantastic. I've loved that.
It's a good record.
For a long time. It's funny. I've heard a lot of covers of Snow Queen, and everybody fucks it up. And the reason they fuck it up is because they don't have that gentle, supple touch that Jim does. He allows the track to simmer in a way that another great band that I absolutely love is The Association, but they cover this song and there's absolutely no subtlety to it. Ted Bluchell comes out with no understanding of the subtlety of the dynamics of it. And a lot of the versions I've heard of Snow Queen are like that. That is just the first song. There's a staggering array of great material on that record, I think.
Jim's playing was always compositional. He was not a timekeeper, although he had perfect time, but he saw the drums as a whole instrument, and he worked to embed his drum parts in the infrastructure of the music, in the composition of it. And that's the trick of the session musician that Jim's intuition gave him this incredible advantage in.
Right. Because he had learned all these styles so he could chameleonize himself, right?
He knew how to do everything. He'd played with the Burbank Symphony as a teenager. He'd played with the Page Cavanaugh Band, which was an out-and-out jazz band. The guy whose place he took was Henry Mancini's drummer. Mm-hmm. So he was thoroughly versed in the whole realm of modern American music, from, symphonic down to, little jazz combos.
Is this the part of his career then where he was so busy that he would fly to LA from Vegas every day to do 2 or 3 recording sessions and then hit the evening show at Caesar's Palace by the evening?
He did a long run at Caesar's with Andy Williams in 67 and was splitting up with his wife. So he really wanted to be out of town. And yeah, he would fly in and do daytime sessions and then go back and hit the bandstand at night.
Yeah, that's pretty nuts. So he's like he's flying every day from Vegas to LA, Vegas to LA.
I don't know how much he was doing that. From what I can tell, the sessions slacked off while he was in Vegas. Before he went to Vegas, he was doing sessions every day. And then, the couple months he was in Vegas with Andy, there were more like 3 a week.
And then second part of 69 is a whole different story. First part of 69 is Jim feeling himself before the cannon blast of Delaney and Bonnie. And So what that really equates to is a couple of really cool sessions, but also his own solo album, which you hit me to. And he was co-drummer of the first Bread album. Let's talk about the solo record, which is, not extremely noteworthy, but at least he did one. It came out in April 1969. Jimmy Gordon and his jazz and pops band Hog Fat.
There's a second album out of those same sessions called Spontaneous Combustion. That's not a Jim Gordon record, but it's the same band. It's just those guys, Mike Melvin on keyboards, Don Peake on guitar, Tom Scott on saxophone, Gary Coleman on additional percussion. It's the guys he played music with every day in the studio with Bob Thiel, who was a real laissez-faire record producer, jazzbo out of the jazz world, right? Yeah, man, that's close enough. And I think they cut those two albums in 3 days.
I'm surprised it took that long, honestly.
Well, it was 18 songs, so it's
yeah. No, it's good stuff, man. I appreciate you telling me about that. The Bread album I like Bread before they really knew exactly what they were and went, whole hog into the soft rock direction. Also, Arlo Guthrie's coming into Los Angeles, and, most surprisingly, because I thought it was Dallas Taylor, is Marrakesh Express by CSN. That drum figure is fantastic. That sort of skipping valedictory run that he does, no idea that was Jim.
Well, it certainly doesn't sound like anybody else, like any other track on that record, does it?
No, it doesn't.
Jim's fingerprints are just so identifiable, and you've been listening to him for a while now. I'm sure it's jumping out at you too, because there's these, I don't know what you call them. Keltner called it a bounce, but it's just the way he handles the interior rhythms between the 1 and the 4, and the way he divides time is so deeply personal. It's just not the kind of rigid division of time that most drummers aspire to. He's so confident in his command of the world of rhythm that he's into microtones and microbeats, and it's truly intuition-led drumming.
So when you think of Jim, what's the first song or image that comes to you? I mean, there's got to be one thing.
E.W. Stevenson, My Maria.
That track?
Yep.
For me, it's probably that locomotive thing that he does for Only You Know and I Know, the Dave Mason version, or anything on Mad Dogs. I think of that locomotive train thing that he does.
That's the paradiddle on Delaney and Bonnie's Only You Know and I Know, where the stop breaks, he just pulls out of the track and the whole thing just falls apart while Leon hits the keyboard. And then Jim comes back in with the paradiddle and ties it all back together. That's an amazing track. And then a month later, he goes in the studio and redoes the song with Dave Mason and totally reinvents the rhythm track to the song. It's truly remarkable. Paradiddle is the #1 Jim Gordon move. It's marching band stuff. You don't see Charlie Watts paradiddling. It doesn't go with the blues band thing. But Jim incorporates it so skillfully and so thoroughly in all his work. Layla's riddled with paradiddle.
So correct me if I'm wrong here, because I'm not a musician, but paradiddle's really all about filling up all the space, right? It's about saturation.
Paradiddle is a double stroke repeated on both sticks.
Right. So it's really, in a sense, an absence of subtlety and a proliferation of pure energy, right?
I would think it's more like a fine point stitching that has to be delivered absolutely perfectly and has to be drilled. A lot of paradiddle stuff is really sloppy and smears the beat and calls attention to itself. In Jim's case, it's like applying a drill. And he's in total command and control of it. So I think it's more nuanced than anything.
Okay. So when did he have his daughter? And did you speak with her for the book?
The family has been incredibly supportive of my work without wanting to be involved in it.
Okay.
They have been severely traumatized by Jim's illness. I completely understand and support them in that. On the other hand, that doesn't mean I haven't been in touch with them. The daughter is in her 50s. She lives in Switzerland. It's been a lifetime for her. She was very close to her grandmother.
Was she at all close with Jim?
Jim was a very difficult father. He didn't really have the skills to connect with people. That is a symptom of his condition.
Okay, so Jim and Jill, they're done now. Just in time for phase 2 to go down, which is Top of the World, Ma. 1969 to 1974. Really, the latter part of 1969 to 72, Jim was white hot and untouchable. Hi, I'm Dave Gebrow. I threw my career as a licensed hearing instrument specialist in the trash, sold my house, and moved to the East Coast with my wife and 4-year-old son in order to focus on making the ultimate podcast for music obsessives thrive. Now I need your help. Although Discograffiti is rated in the top 2% of all podcasts globally, the economics of this thing are tricky. Becoming a member of Discograffiti's Patreon gives you access to over 100 more exclusive episodes. And moving forward now every Sunday for only $5 a month as a private first class, you get our new weekly show by and for Discograffiti's Patreon family, the Discograffiti Soldiers of Sound podcast. It'll be hosted by Rudy Fishman, and given his sociopathic tendencies, I'm sure it'll have a lunatic's take over the asylum edge to it. If all you want to do is show some love, there's now finally a $1 tier. Don't miss out. Become a recruit and get your personalized backstage pass for $1. And for the cheapskates, homeless people, and all the bums sponging off mom and dad, don't care, just join. It's now completely free to join as a basic member, and it'll be the only place you'll be able to get our upcoming Lou Barlow, Corey Hansen, Mark Robinson comp, Metal Machine Muzak, as well as the triple album rock opera Elf Harmony I created with Joe Kennedy as the mentally regarded, and the ability to purchase one-off Patreon episodes. That's it. Back to the show. Just in time for phase 2 to go down, which is Top of the World, Ma. 1969 to 1974. Really, the latter part of 1969 to 72, Jim was white hot and untouchable. I mean, in an almost unparalleled way, where I've never really seen anyone just skate like a rock skipping over a pond from thing to thing to thing. Just, it's like life's got him carried to all the top of the heap sessions and stages. One of our most longtime listeners, David Tabachman, wanted me to ask you, Jim Gordon became a road drummer at the peak of his earning potential as a session player. Did he just have a love of the road, or did they pay him the big bucks?
$125 a week was what Delaney and Bonnie paid him. He was making that by the hour in the studio.
What was his reasoning then? Was it just aesthetic?
So 1969, Dave, making records was no longer the coolest thing in the music business. Being in a rock band was. Led Zeppelin was brand new. And their 2.5-hour show included a half-hour drum solo from John Bonham. The Who were touring with Keith Moon on drums, and they were playing the whole Tommy thing. And then that's the year the Stones came back. Suddenly, the glamour, the glory, the whole action of the scene had shifted from the studios to the stages.
Right.
And Jim caught on to this Delaney and Bonnie thing, and it vaulted him into the royal court of British rock. And they'd never seen anything like that over there. Really. I mean, the level of that stuff in England, it just wasn't on a par with what was going on the West Coast. So Gordon shows up with Delaney and Bonnie, and Eric Clapton and George Harrison just go, wow, what is that? And everybody that got on stage with Jim felt the same way. How this guy could wrap his drums around you and hug you and lift you up as a guitarist, as a singer, as any kind of musician in the band. And he did it with orchestration, not volume. He did it with understanding the compositional elements of the percussion. He was one of a kind. Yeah. So he shows up in London at the point when London was the middle of the pop music world. The Beatles had just broken up. George Harrison was starting his solo album. And who's on drums? Oh, Ringo's on drums. But Ringo has to leave town.
Delaney and Bonnie, everyone was flocking there. You had George Harrison, sort of keeping his head down on stage, just wanting to, groove in a band. You had a rhythm section that would soon become the rhythm section of some of the most important music ever made. And it all coalesced around Delaney and Bonnie. Before that scene fragmented, there were so many efforts that came out as a result, and almost all of them are classics. Obviously Derek and the Dominos being the final act of that. And then what I realized when I laid it all out is that whole D&B nexus, his work with them was basically finished within a year. That was it. He'd kind of went off into another thing. But you had Delaney and Bonnie on tour with Eric Clapton, D&B together. Then that first Eric Clapton album, which I'm not really a fan of that record, but you do have Let It Rain And I know, again, it's another step in the direction of Mad Dogs. Now let's talk about Mad Dogs. So Mad Dogs and Englishmen is the Joe Cocker tour, which he famously showed up completely blitzed out of his mind, exhausted for, and was, you probably know a hell of a lot more about the mafioso inspiration behind the tour on that one, right?
D. Anthony?
Right.
Yeah, there's no real explaining how that came about, but, D. Anthony wasn't paying any attention to Joe's need for rest and relaxation. Yeah, they had like 8 days to get on the road, and he didn't have a band.
And so he left it. He just pleaded with Leon. Leon Russell stepped up and put the band together. Anyone out there who has not seen this film or heard, forget about the double album. Get the one with the double plus all the extras. If it's not the greatest live album of all time, it is certainly in the top 5. And an important aspect of his work in his personal life started here, which is he starts to do speedballs.
Yeah, the Mad Dogs and Englishmen tour was where Jim really began to exercise an enthusiastic interest in drug use. The whole thing was a rolling bacchanal, but in Jim's case, he had an ability to absorb massive amounts of drugs without any apparent deleterious effect, especially on his playing. His playing never faltered. Keltner tells the story of Jim coming backstage with a handful of Owsley LSD tabs, and Keltner breaking off a little piece and taking a little piece of one, and Jim gobbling down a whole pill. And then they go out to play, and Keltner can't even remember what rhythm is. He can't bring himself to hit a stick on a drum. He's sitting behind his drums just wondering, what am I here for? And Jim is on it. He's playing, and he's looking over at Keltner and screaming, play! And Keltner finally just got up and left and burst into tears. So there's tons of stories about Jim's ability to just consume massive amounts of this stuff. Again, it speaks to his unique electrochemical setup.
Yeah. And then is this the first instance where there's any kind of recorded violence against women with Rita Coolidge?
The first we know about, yeah. And it seems to have just emerged out of nowhere. On the other hand, it's not quite the story that Rita Coolidge tells.
You want to relay the tale?
It's sorted, but the fact is that Jim had been fooling around with another one of the gals in the troupe, and she'd left her hotel room key under Jim's pillow, and Rita found it. And she was miffed, and she was riding Jim about it and bellyaching about this enough that it came to the attention of other people in the troupe. They were like, what's she on about? I mean, there's so much stuff going on here. What's the big deal, right? And apparently this worked up a great deal of resentment in Jim that came out at this unexpected moment where he asked her out into the hallway and knocked her unconscious with a punch. Now, she says that was the end of the relationship, but it wasn't. They got back together after the end of the tour. She was living with her sister, who was married to Booker T at the time, and Jim was living in a Volkswagen camper that he parked in Booker's driveway. In fact, when Jim went to London to join Derek and the Dominos, Rita took him to the airport.
That's interesting. So yeah, she obviously is retrospectively mortified that she stayed with him, as would anyone. So then these guys, they're not Derek and the Dominos yet, but feeling like legendary figures at this early stage, and they become kind of the foundational house band for George Harrison's All Things Must Pass. Jim then went on to play on Living in the Material World and Extra Texture, read all about it. But really his work, I know you're a big fan of Awaiting on You All, and how could you not be? His work on this record is nuts.
Yeah, those other tracks you're talking about were cut at those sessions. He didn't do any further sessions with George Harrison later. They were just left over. I was saying, that Ringo started out on the drums. That's Ringo on He's So Fine, My Sweet Lord. He had to go to Nashville and do some sessions on a solo record of his. And when he came back, Jim was on the drum chair, and George gave Ringo a tambourine.
I got to tell you, man, if it's because of Boku's of Blues, it was worth it, because that's Ringo's best solo album. When I met Ringo, that's what I fucking told him, is Boku's of Blues is your best album.
Ringo didn't mind. He thought Jim was amazing. They end up playing double drums on sessions there together.
Isn't Pete Drake all over Boku's of Blues? Was that what brought him over to George Harrison?
Could be. I have no idea.
Yeah, obviously an insanely good record. Then there was a Bobby Keys solo LP, and then Layla. So let's talk about the guys in Derek and the Dominos. We've got a one Eric Clapton. We've got Jim Gordon, Bobby Whitlock on organ, background vox, Carl Radle bassist. I'm not a huge Eric Clapton fan, as you could surmise from my made-up surname, but Derek and the Dominos is, to me, that's not Eric Clapton, that's Derek and the Dominos. One of the greatest albums of all time, in the top 5 double albums of all time. When I think of Jim, one of the first things that pops into my mind is his work on Keep on Growing.
There's a lot of overdubs on that.
Is there a drum overdub?
Yeah, that's a lot. He dumped a lot of percussion on that track.
Okay, I didn't know that. So talk to me about the sessions here, because first of all, there's that gatefold where if you look in the gatefold, this is a doomed band, obviously. Even Duane Allman passed away after having gone through the ranks. And there's a woman who's on the inside front cover who she went missing in the 70s, apparently. And then Carl Radle died in 1980. Clapton and Whitlock are the only two that made it out of that band.
To the degree they did. The recording sessions were held in Miami, and it became an opportunity for the 4 musicians to just saturate themselves with heroin use. They had dabbled prior to that, but when they hit Miami, it became a thing. The bags of powder on top of the amplifiers in the studio. So it was recorded in a kind of drugged out blitz in a very short period of time, like under a couple weeks. Allman shows up the 3rd day. The producer, Tom Dowd, brought them in. He'd been producing the Allman Brothers Band. He really sparked a tremendous feeling. The band had toured England doing very small halls. Those shows were apparently just magnificent, just incredible. And they went straight from that, like the next night, to Miami and recorded this thing in just this blur of drugs and alcohol and music. And when they came back to put the finishing touches on it, Clapton still didn't satisfied with Layla. And he'd heard a piano piece that Jim and Rita had played for him and convinced Jim that they could put that on the end of Layla.
Clapton convinced Jim of that?
Yeah. Clapton knew all about this piece, and he knew where it came from. He knew who wrote it. And the final version is a composite of Jim playing piano and Whitlock playing piano. Whitlock didn't care for it, didn't think it was a good piece musically, knew who'd written it, didn't feel it fit on the piece, but he was wrong. And why they didn't put Rita's name on, I can't tell you anything more than they were pirates and she was just a wench.
Yeah, there was obviously a lot of blatant sexism in music at that time. But to be fair, when you listen to Priscilla Coolidge's version with Booker Jones, which is called Time, it's not even close to the coda on Layla. So I'm glad at least it's on this record, because since its use in Goodfellas, it's kind of seen as sort of the ultimate elegiac piece of music in a sense. And it never ceases to not deliver chills down my spine when it kicks in. And it's that cymbal whoosh. When that happens, always chills down my spine. Always.
There's some fantastic isolated drum tracks from Layla out there on the internet. It's not abundantly obvious how brilliant the percussion patterns and what Jim's doing on the drums on that track are. But when you dial up these isolated versions and you see, you were talking about nuance and subtlety.
Yeah.
It's genius drumming.
It really is. That song is a towering accomplishment, but there's not much on there that is less than that. Key to the Highway is maybe the only song that I would say if you got rid of that, I wouldn't blink an eye. But even that has its place. It's a great record. All the gigs that I heard them play, even though they're on heroin, they're sounding like Fast and Furious on this. But the heroin catches up with them by the time they hit the road, because everything sounds like a congealed slog by the time they hit the stage. Do you feel that way?
I don't think anybody was particularly happy with the performances on the U.S. tour, although they did get a live album out of it. But yeah, Whitlock told me that he kept watching Clapton during the second show at the Fillmore East because he thought the guy was going to fall over on his face.
It's really a shame. It's one of the greatest bands of all time, and I've never heard a document that truly seems to have captured them in that kind of white-hot intensity that D&B had on stage. There's still some good stuff from the unreleased second record. So they got back in the studio, right? What happened when they started recording again? What went down there?
Well, they didn't have material. They didn't have the same kind of freshness around their relationship. They were all pissed off and antagonized with each other, and they didn't have Tom Dowd. They went in the studio unprepared. They had Andy Johns as their engineer. He's a great set of ears, but he's not an adult authority figure like Tom Dowd. Yeah, the relationships had just deteriorated to the point where nobody could stand anybody anymore. It blew up in the studio over Jim tuning his drums for 2 hours.
So who's the biggest cheerleader of this thing actually continuing? Was it Whitlock?
At that point, they all hated each other. They were all out of inspiration. Heroin had destroyed their lives. Clapton, after he walked out of the Derek and the Dominos session, wasn't heard from for 3 years.
The Rainbow gig is the first thing, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
And that was Pete Townsend trying to get Clapton out of his house.
Right. So they broke up for good in 72. I read a quote somewhere. Jim Gordon said, the producers wouldn't pay me for Layla because they said I'd be dead in 6 months anyway. I don't know if that's true or not, but what happened with that other girl? There was another woman around this time.
Chris O'Dell was somebody who worked at Apple and had become involved with Leon Russell. She's the inspiration to his song Pisces Apple Lady. And she wound up working at Clapton's place in the country. And she and Jim struck up a relationship. Eventually, there was some violent episode just before the tour. He chased her around the apartment with a knife, surprised the hell out of her, scared her to death, and it was only interrupted by somebody just unexpectedly dropping by. And she said he apologized later, although he didn't remember using a knife. And after apologizing, it was never mentioned again.
That's wild. I wasn't alive during that time. I was born in 72, but around that time, it seems like one of the biggest complications about people being held accountable for their actions is that you had language like, that's his bag, don't harsh his trip, things like that, which would allow psychotic behavior to not only occur, but it's a perfect breeding ground for it.
One of the things I said in the book about the Mad Dogs and Englishmen thing was that there's no small irony that amongst these people and all their terrible behavior, they couldn't distinguish authentic psychotic behavior.
Right.
It just didn't stand out.
Right. That's terrifying. That really is. I mean, because Jim's not the only guy or the first guy, to wander through a situation where there should have been red flags hoisted way high up in the air for everyone to see. So the last thing that really went down, that kind of capped the Delaney and Bonnie era, is Dave Mason's Alone Together, a phenomenal record. Also one of the most beautiful slabs of vinyl that I own, that speckled marble color vinyl.
You like that record, but don't like the Clapton solo record. Interesting. And that record was 3 hours out of Jim's life.
What, Dave Mason?
Yeah.
Oh, no way. I didn't realize that.
Yeah.
To me, that feels like on a par with the other stuff. And then Eric Clapton's eponymous thing, it feels super tentative. And frankly, I'm not at all a fan of his solo career at all. So to me, this is a perfect...
I'm with you there. I think Clapton's towing the line of one of the most overrated talents in rock history. The solo career has been largely useless, but that Delaney and Bonnie record that he did with them, the live one, yeah, but I mean what you called the eponymous Eric Clapton album, that's as sound a record as he's ever made. The ensemble is spectacular and the material is decent enough. I mean, really, he's still singing half those songs. The Dave Mason record, it's got a couple good tracks on it. And then again, Dave Mason, he's just like an extremely modest talent and a very limited personality. But that track you're talking about, Only You and I Know. Ooh, yeah, I mean, like I said, that album's 3 hours out of Jim's life.
That's amazing to me. I love that record. I think it's a 5-star record. And the only other thing that I've ever heard from him besides that I think is awesome is the one he did with Mama Cass, Next Up. I like that one. I think that's underrated.
Oh, I'm sure it's underrated because it's not rated at all.
That's true. That is true. All right. So 70 to 71 is the rest of Jim's stay in London. So let's just talk about a few tracks and also the other band that he joined, because, he's not going to let the disintegration of Derek and the Dominos hold him back. So Randy Newman's Have You Seen My Baby? Then he's hooking up with John Lennon with Power to the People and Imagine. And by the way, it's one of the only tracks where I don't like Jim's drum work is Power to the People. I
love that piece. That is Jim. I don't want to say channeling. That's Jim's take on Ringo.
Is it really?
And, clearly. He's going to play with John Lennon. He's going to play like Ringo, only not like Ringo. Ringo couldn't do what he does on that track. Those things you talk about paradiddle. Those are constantly mutating, cascading drum rolls. It's a fantastic part. The technical ability on that drum part is staggering. And then the other thing is, it's Jim's vision of what Ringo could sound like.
Right.
I think that's one of Jim's masterpieces.
That's interesting. I'm definitely going to go back and check that out again because it's one of the only songs that he plays on that takes me out of the song because of his work.
He's crashing on it, and Spector gives him the mix, which he doesn't always get. A lot of Jim's best work is buried in a terrible mix.
Right.
But Spector knew what to do with Jim. Yeah, no, I think that record's powerful. I do not think the other track off Imagine, what is it? It's So Hard. I don't think that's anything special.
It's okay. Is that the only one he's on Imagine?
Yeah.
Okay. Okay. A couple other tracks to mention. He's playing with some really high shelf blues guys. B.B. King in London, John Lee Hooker, we might as well call it Through. Not a fan of Barbra Streisand, but I got to say that the song Beautiful on your track list you put together is awesome.
The bitch can sing.
Yeah. Enough said. So, two other things about 71. Nilsson Schmilsson, which jump into the fire unquestionably. If you had to put 10 must-hear Jim tracks, that would be on it for sure. He's all over the record, right?
Yeah, he's not on Without You.
Okay.
That's Keltner. There's some Keltner sessions in there, but yeah, he's all over that place. That's him on Coconut, and Coconut's an amazing drum part.
Yeah, Coconut's awesome. He's also, of course, was on Aerial Ballet, the soundtrack to Skidoo, Harry, and the Son of Dracula soundtrack. So a definite mainstay for Nilsson. But most importantly, he becomes a member of Traffic. I like Low Spark of High Heeled Boys. However, I believe Traffic was past their prime at that point. And the song that he writes for that record, Rock and Roll Stew, is definitely not a great song. It's not Layla. But he provides some really good work to that record. And you can hear Jim on Welcome to the Canteen as well.
I'm not with you on that. I think that Traffic at their prime. The live gigs were unbelievable, as Welcome to the Canteen makes it obvious. I don't know how many drummers are athletic enough to do 9 minutes of paradiddles on Give Me Some Lovin'.
Yeah.
It's extraordinary. Capaldi wanted to sing. He wanted out from the drum set, and Capaldi wasn't the world's greatest drummer. Jim was. And they threw in an extra conga player and had Gretsch holding down the root. It is the most powerful version of the band. Jim joined them on stage and started gigging with them within a month after the end of Derek and the Dominos.
Wow.
It lasted for the rest of the year, so like 6 or 7 months. And that's a big English tour, including the second Glastonbury Fair. There's footage of it on the internet. Nick Rose shot it.
Oh, cool.
Then they did a U.S. tour. They were phenomenal, and that was their best record at that point, and it was their best-selling record.
No way. No, their first two records tower over that, I think. But it's still a good record. It's not Where Eagles Fly. That's a piece of shit. But I think they were slightly past their prime. I love having somebody who's super comfortable with their taste duking it out with me on this show. It's the greatest.
It's Winwood coming into his own as a keyboard player, and the whole band dynamics are just phenomenal. Paved the way for a shootout at the factory with the Muscle Shoals guys. That was a high point for those guys.
Was he dismissed from the band, or what happened?
Oh, yeah. They couldn't handle those guys. Gretsch was as bad as Jim, and so was Rebop. They were drunken. They were using every kind of drugs imaginable. They were misbehaving in the sort of rock star ways, and that wasn't Winwood and Capaldi. I mean, they put up with Chris Wood drinking because he was really sort of quiet and calm. But those guys, you know, outside of a little occasional reefer and some LSD, they weren't really wild and crazy guys. And the whole Jim Gordon, Rebop, and Rick Gretsch thing was a little bit appalling to them.
So he was thrown out of the band.
They were dismissed, yeah.
So he comes back to California from London. And by all accounts, this is a really good period in his life. Obviously, very much in demand as a drummer. He became sober around this point?
Sober. No.
No, okay.
That's a little bit later he does that. No, he was drinking heavily in an effort to stay off heroin.
I'm sorry. Did I say become sober? I meant became a full-fledged alcoholic. So he buys a new house in Sherman Oaks, begins seeing his daughter again, and married the singer-songwriter Renee Armand, right?
Renee, he met her on doing sessions on her album. They became a couple, and then Jim sort of took over the production of the album. And he plays keyboards, guitar, he's the producer. He's written songs on there. That was a creative explosion for Jim.
How would you assess his performance on that?
It's Jim coming out from behind the drum set.
Is that a good look at it, though?
Well, the role model was the Carole King Tapestry record, although Renee comes from much more of a jazz background. And the songs, they're more obscure than Carole King stuff, which is so immediately accessible. I don't think the record ever really had a chance. But it certainly opened Jim up as a creative person. And that was something that was going on for him in England. You know, he wanted to write with Derek and the Dominos. He produced that Bobby Keys record. He wrote Rock and Roll Stew. You know, he was beginning to test his creative abilities beyond the drum set.
I do know that there was at least one incident with Renee where he said to her, I know what you're doing. And then he points to three things on the floor and says, the magic triangle.
Devil's Triangle, yeah.
Devil's Triangle.
Yeah, he exploded on Renee and beat her up pretty badly. And that was the end of the marriage. It lasted less than 6 months. Right. Jim was not capable of the kind of intimate relationship that he longed for. It was not in his psychological abilities any more than it was for him to be a father to Amy. He just couldn't make those connections, although, like I say, he aspired to very deeply.
It's at around this time when his behavior becomes noticeable. The bassist Max Bennett said he was always a quiet guy, but the quiet became very loud and everybody left him alone. So I guess during breaks at work, he would stand alone in the corner talking to himself in a whisper. That's the kind of thing you can't really explain away.
Yeah, there was a point where the shyness melded into an uncomfortable introversion, and the struggles that were going on inside Jim to maintain his equanimity and to continue to function in the real world were just getting more and more dramatic for him.
Oh, hi, Dave again. I got to tell you about the next tier. As a lieutenant, you get an ad-free, substantially elongated director's cut of every episode, and you'll be getting the shows an entire week early from now on. And now back to our expertly crafted program. I believe it's at around this time when his behavior becomes noticeable. The bassist Max Bennett said he was always a quiet guy, but the quiet became very loud and everybody left him alone. So I guess during breaks at work, he would stand alone in the corner talking to himself in a whisper. That's the kind of thing you can't really explain away.
Yeah, there was a point where the shyness melded into an uncomfortable introversion, and the struggles that were going on inside Jim to maintain his equanimity and to continue to function in the real world were just getting more and more dramatic for him. In 75, he started seeing psychiatrists, but he wouldn't tell them what was going on. He told them that he was depressed about his marriage ending and depressed about his poor relationship with his daughter. But he didn't mention that his head was filled with voices ordering him to do stuff.
Classic.
It is classic and very typical. But because he was so high functioning, because he had this tremendous professional profile and was operating on such a high level, the medical professionals just were bamboozled. They didn't see beyond his depression and just thought, well, this guy's got trouble with drugs and alcohol and depression. They'd give him antidepressant medicine. And this is in the 70s when it's the dawn of psychiatric medicine. Stuff was really heavy-handed, ham-fisted stuff. I don't think it made much difference to him, but he absorbed it. He was taking those things along with all the illegal and along with all the drinking.
Yeah.
And it just wasn't maintaining what he needed to do. And so about 75, there are things starting to happen that people notice. And it's like, what's with Jim?
It happens as late as 75? I thought it was a couple years earlier it became noticeable.
75 is when, he starts yelling at the Hall & Oates session and is a heavy interest in seeing different psychiatrists. In 76, he finally admitted himself to the hospital and confessed that he was hearing voices.
72 to 74 is truly the final flush of his classic session work. You could even make the argument that this is the peak, because you're going from the incredible bongo band's bongo rock, which just Apache alone, there's a movie made about. It's the most frequently sampled drum break ever.
It's fundamental to the world of hip hop.
It really is. And then an artist who I never cared for solo, but I understand that Jim's work in this area is crucial for a more music concrete aspect of him. His work with Frank Zappa on Apostrophe is fundamental to Jim's career.
Well, that's just a jam from a New York recording session during the Wazoo tour that Zappa edited up into a very exciting instrumental. And yeah, Jim is phenomenal on that piece. If you were to review the live tapes of the Grand Wazoo band, which is like 25 pieces or something like that, Jim's unbelievable on that. Zappa's, of course, a combination of reading and improvisation. And so the reading is very demanding, very exacting. And Jim was brilliant at that. The improvisation, no problem. Jim was open and ready for that. So all this Grand Wazoo stuff is out now, both the Grand Wazoo and the subsequent Petite Wazoo. And Jim's just phenomenal on that stuff. He just ate it up. And there's nothing else in Jim's catalog like the Zappa stuff. It was symphonic, it was orchestral, and yet it was drum based.
Yeah, that's why it seems so important, is because he never really got to exercise those chops that much outside of his work with Zappa. And then You're So Vain, honestly, really like the only essential work that Carly Simon ever did. Jim's all over that stuff, you know, from No Secrets, Hotcakes, and Playing Possum, then make some side deviations into soft rock with Summer Breeze, Seals and Crofts, and Albert Hammond's It Never Rains in Southern California. The 2 Bobby Whitlock records that he did post Derek and the Dominos. And then there was a slew of good sessions. Your favorite, My Maria, in 73. And 74 is, to me, even a higher peak. Midnight at the Oasis is a great single. Rock the Boat, right at the precipice of the introduction of disco. You Are So Beautiful, bringing him back with Joe Cocker. And
There's no drums on You Are So Beautiful.
Is he on that record?
He's on some of the album sessions, but there are no drums on You Are So Beautiful.
Okay. I'm going to keep that in the show, you know, just to underscore my humanity, my fallibility. I love his work with Gordon Lightfoot. Sundown's amazing. You know, that kind of brings us to one of the last big things that he did before 75 hits, which is Pretzel Logic.
Well, let me tell you about You're So Vain, because that is Jim's masterpiece. And
I think that's his best work.
It's his masterpiece. It is the record where Jim's work is the most crucial, most obvious, and most transformational. But Jim was the 3rd drummer on that track. The first time they cut it with Carly's band, and the drummer was Andy Newmark. It wasn't what Richard Perry wanted. So they brought in a British guy, and he cut the drum track. Wasn't there yet. Jim is in London with Zappa. He's got one night off. He happens to call Richard Perry, who he knows is in town. Perry says, "What are you doing tonight? Come down to the studio." He comes down to the studio. Perry forgot to tell Carly, so she threw a shit fit when she saw Jim Gordon and Frank Zappa at the session. "What? Isn't this track done? We already finished this track." And Andy Newmark was there. I spoke to him about this, and he asked Jim, could he sit in the drum booth while Jim cut the track? Jim said, sure. So Andy sat there for 5 hours, 60 takes. He said when Jim was done, he had not made a single mistake, and the drum head was cratered like 6 inches deep. That was the track. When you go back and listen to it, you'll see what Jim did to the pre-chorus with the 8th notes on the floor tom and the stand tom rolling into the cymbal crash is just tease up this chorus in such a brilliant way. And Perry worked on that for 5 hours to make sure that he had exactly what he wanted on the drums with that track. And that's the story on that. The Pretzel Logic story is also pretty interesting because Steely Dan was a record producer named Gary Katz and the 2 songwriters, Walter Becker and Don Fagen. They were signed to a record deal, and they started making a record before anybody knew at the record company. And there's, wait, who are these guys? And really quickly, they grabbed a couple of other musicians and became a group, right? The drummer was okay, but he wasn't what they wanted. So when they come to do their 3rd album, they decide that they're going to workshop their records. They're no longer going to use the unit that they called Steely Dan, but they were going to employ session musicians and work all over this. And the first thing they did was they brought in a drummer. And this guy was a 19-year-old phenomenon from the Sonny and Cher band named Jeff Porcaro. Jeff Porcaro's father had been a session player, and he went to Grant High School, where Jim's legacy just loomed so large. And he worshiped at the altar of Jim Gordon. And he says to these guys, I don't know why you're hiring me. You should hire Jim Gordon. So they do. And Jim comes in and cuts Rikki, Don't Lose That Number. And they didn't let him go. They eventually brought Porcaro in, and Porcaro and Jim do a double drum track. But Pretzel Logic is all Jim.
Was he considered part of the band, a la Traffic or Derek and the Dominos?
No, they were workshopping. They Chuck Rainey's on bass, and Dean Parks is on guitar. Dean Parks, by the way, I asked him about Steely Dan sessions. I said, what were they like? He said, tedious.
Yeah, that's what it sounds like. Yeah, it's a bunch of musos trying to get every note perfect. I love the band, but that's what it was. That could be my favorite Steely Dan record because they hadn't gotten precious with it yet. It wasn't this arid studio-based atmosphere that felt airless. It's still
antiseptic.
Yeah. And I don't mind the antiseptic thing because it works with their aesthetic, but Pretzel Logic, it was kind of the peak before they went down that slide. Tom Murrow, who's a loyal listener of ours, he asks, was Any Major Dude Will Tell You written about Jim Gordon?
Not to my knowledge.
Okay. And he also asks if that is Jim Gordon walking past in the brown leather coat on the left-hand side of the cover of Tom Waits' The Heart of Saturday Night.
Don't know that either.
Okay.
Jim's on that record.
Yeah, I know. And when he asked that question, I thought, that's obscure. But then I looked on the cover. It really does kind of look like Jim.
I'll have to check that out.
By the mid-'70s, the wheels started coming off, right?
Very much so. The Souther Hillman Foray Band is a turning point. He had been so under attack by his condition, and it had undermined his confidence, and he wanted to join this band. And he asked if he could audition. And I was like, what? Of course, just take the job. But right from the start, it was not the same Jim. He was remote. He was standoffish, played great, but he was difficult to deal with. And then when they went out on tour, he was problematic the whole time. I mean, he was violent and throwing stuff at the other guys. And for the first time, his drinking and drug using was starting to affect his playing. And that had never happened before.
I know later on there's a more famous session where he stops and accuses people of messing with his time. But right at this point, wasn't he stopping in the middle of a take and saying, you're the devil, you're messing with my time?
I think that's coming a little bit later. That, you're talking about like the Steve Harley episode or the Johnny Rivers thing. They're mystifying moments for everybody that was involved.
Right.
It's kind of dark humor, but on the other hand, so much pain underneath this. It's hard to say. But Dean Parks tells about the Johnny Rivers session, and they're just about done. They've got a few minutes left. They're going to try one more song, and Jim starts in on this. I know what you're doing. You stop that, Dean.
Yeah.
I know what you're doing. You're messing my time. You're making it so I can't hit the whole note at the beginning on the one. And Dean's like, what are you talking about? And Johnny Rivers, who's the producer as well as the singer, he says, oh, come on, Jim. He can't do that from over there. Now count off and let's get going. And Jim goes, 1, 2, 3.
Right. That's how you diffuse schizophrenia, with pragmatism.
These people had no idea what they were dealing with. And you think about this for a minute. It's like the music business in the 70s had so much patience with drug addicts, drunks, sexual deviants, but they couldn't deal with somebody who was actually mentally ill.
So when you become a major, you get yet another show on Wednesday, either Discograffiti's The Top 10, our Buried Treasure show, Rock Cousteau, our Slag Off show, Queasy Listening, or exclusive limited series like The Private Press with Paul Major. And if you've got no financial worries to speak of, keep in mind that some of the higher Patreon tiers allow you to actually advertise on the show, choose the bands we cover, or even some of the guests we get. For the price of a cup of coffee a week, you can ensure my family's fed, build a music library that'll be the envy of your block, and connect to a thriving community of music maniacs all at the same time. Don't risk feeling badly about yourself by not giving. Patreon.com/Discograffiti. Once again, that's Patreon.com/Discograffiti. I feel like in order to responsibly activate the audience's empathy at this point, we should talk about the Voices, because it wasn't just his mom. The leader of the Voices, please correct me if I'm mistaken here, was a white bearded man, right? And there was also a blonde woman, another dark-haired one. There was his brother, his aunt, and his mom, right?
It got to be very crowded up there, very crowded. But his mother was the chief tormentor. She was the one who wanted him to cut down his eating and wouldn't let him finish his meals, and everybody was harshly critical, and it got worse and worse and worse. Strangers on the street walking by him would say things to him, depressing, discouraging things. He just accepted that. When people accused him of making this up, he said, why would I do that? I want to eat.
Let's talk about the eating. So his mother would make him eat half his food at first?
Jim had issues around weight all his life. He experienced shame over putting on weight, and he had a tendency to put on weight. He was never like a skinny guy. He was a big guy, 6'4", and he'd get up there. So in his mind, his mother wanted him to not eat because then he wouldn't be fat. And that was a subject of shame for him. So his mother would make him stop eating in the middle of a meal. You say, oh, how does she do that? Well, this is one of the most severe symptoms in all of mental illness called command hallucinations. And what it is you have been ordered to do this. And if you don't do it, you will experience severe pain. They call it the electric hat band. But apparently it's like a pain that circles your head and leaves you dropping on the floor, wetting your pants, just intense, incredible pain, like your skin being ripped off slowly. And if you don't do what they say, that's what they do.
That's intense, man. I mean, life is hard enough to live without that kind of shit running the show. And he was actually seeing somebody around this time named Stacey Bailey, who he wound up choking and then told her that he was just joking. It was just a joke.
Jim had outbursts, and they seemed to be largely directed toward women. His resentment toward his mother as a controlling figure in his life obviously sort of migrated into his relationship with all women. Yeah, Stacey Bailey was somebody who lived with him for a brief period of time, who ran out of the house fearing for her life.
Is this the last sort of relationship like this that he has? Are there other?
There were others.
Wow. So in 75 to 76, like we said before, his state starts to become very apparent and the well begins to run dry. You know, you start to look at his work at this time and there's things in there, you know, you're like, whoa, okay, that doesn't really look like something he would have taken just a year ago. The theme from the Rockford Files. Is that Mike Post?
He played all the Post gigs. Mike Post got weepy recalling a cue that Jim played on a Rockford File soundtrack. That was a better gig, but you're right. The gigs started falling off and he wasn't getting the first call things. Guys like Ed Green and Rick Schlosser and Jim Keltner were getting the first calls. Jim was not the irreplaceable, totally dependable guy that he had been just a couple years before.
It was still good work in 76. Here at the Western...
It was still good work. No, he would still go in and cut tracks and they'd be great. It's just the dependability issue was not there. He started showing up late for things. He started not playing consistently. Tracy Nelson told me that her producer, Jimmy Bowen, who had known Jim since the very beginning, would only use Jim every other day because he didn't think Jim had the consistency anymore. People like Richard Perry started using other drummers. Richard Perry never used another drummer. Lenny Warnaker never used other drummers. But suddenly the A work started going to other people. And Jim was doing commercials, TV soundtrack, pre-records.
Still got Here at the Western World, which is a terrific song with a complicated beat. Stephen Bishop's Careless, which is, I think, a good record. He's on the first Tom Petty and the Heartbreakers record on one song.
Oh, that's an amazing track. Those guys remember that like a car crash they were in. Because here's the deal. Mudcrutch had broken up. There was no Heartbreakers. So they decided to do Tom Petty solo sessions. And they call in Al Cooper, Emery Gordy from Emmylou Harris's band. They let Campbell play guitar and Petty play guitar, and they bring in Jim. Jim is triple scale. The other guys are all scale. But the Heartbreaker guys are like, wow! The guy from Layla? Oh, man. So they cut the first track. It's Stranger in the Night, shows up on the first album. But they cut the first track and they go in to listen and everybody likes what they hear. And Jim says to the engineer, do you have a couple of spare tracks? Because I can double my drums. Petty and Campbell look at each other. They have never heard of anybody doubling their drums. Think about that for a minute. That means every cymbal crash, every paradiddle, every kick drum beat has to be exactly the same. He did it in one take.
That's amazing.
You go back and listen to that track.
I definitely will.
And you'll go, and first of all, it definitely ain't Stan Lynch. And then second of all, the timbre of the drums, the depth of the percussion is just unbelievable. And it has to be from doubling the part.
That's amazing. That gives me
That's superhuman.
Yeah, it is. You know, he's on Beautiful Noise, Neil Diamond's album from that year.
A little bit. Yeah, he's on a little bit on that.
There's a Kind of Hush all over the world, Rich Girl. And then, you know, the last person I want to mention from 76, because it kind of becomes like a possible valedictory comeback thing that never was. was The Pretender with Jackson Browne. Because once 77 hits, we're kind of in a different territory. So this is phase 3, really deep in the deep end, 1977 to 1983. The year kicks off with an Alice Cooper record and then Johnny Rivers' Outside Help. Let's talk about Johnny Rivers' Outside Help.
Well, that's where the outburst happened, where he accused Dean Parks of messing with his time. Yeah, things were falling apart by that point, and he was really struggling, and everybody knew it. So he wasn't getting the work, and he ended up going on the road with Burton Cummings. Harry had used him on the Burton Cummings sessions, and Cummings had brought his Canadian band down to Hollywood to record. And the drummer just wasn't making it, and so they replaced the drummer, but the other Canadian guys were on the session. And all of a sudden, like, to have Jim in the band just elevated everything so much for them that Burton was willing to pay Jim's fee and take him out on the road. Burton Cummings, I should mention, he was the lead singer for Guess Who, which was Canada's most famous rock band. So he was nobody in America, but in Canada, he was a big deal. And so Jim just gets out of Dodge and heads for Winnipeg, music capital of the Western world. In the winter of 77, he's touring Canada with Burton Cummings and struggling to maintain and keep his truck between the gutters and not going up on the sidewalk. He had 2 tours with Burton. It was relaxing for him because he was playing with musicians who were not on the same caliber as him. He's not in the studio with Dean Parks and Michael O'Marty. And these are Canadian guys. There's Burton's road band. And it was easy for him.
Right.
As long as he could keep it together. And it just got harder and harder the more he was out on the road. And they stopped back in LA in between 2 tours for 3 days. And Jim called them, road manager, said, I'm not coming out again.
So he, at this time, I think he was calling his mom and screaming at her to leave him alone. And she had no idea what he was talking about, right?
Jim's mom was very much part of the AA world. And her husband had joined AA in 1958. He died in 1972. But her whole social life was around AA meetings, and she was thoroughly indoctrinated into the 12-step program.
Because of the dad or because she was an alcoholic?
Al-Anon.
Okay, got it.
The AA program in the 70s and 80s was pretty rudimentary. They didn't really understand what we've come to call dual diagnosis, which is somebody who is both addicted and mentally ill. Poses entirely different problems than somebody who is just addicted. And his mother never realized fully that Jim's problems were beyond drugs and alcohol. She was under the impression that if Jim stopped drinking and using, everything would be all right.
I think these screaming sessions on the phone was the fulcrum point for him starting this endless turnstile of hospital visits, right? He went to Van Nuys Psychiatric Hospital. That was the first one. And then after 2 months, Jim checked himself out against everyone's advice. And that was the first one that there were like a dozen more, right?
Yeah, he was very depressed by the lack of progress with his hospital admission. And he went home and tried to kill himself.
Right.
And was readmitted to the hospital. And yeah, there's like 15 hospital admissions in the next few years. He was in and out of mental hospital and drug rehab programs all the time.
And he was allowed 1 bite of food per meal at this point. Yeah.
That would happen.
And then
he'd go to a restaurant, he'd order the food, it would come, he'd take a bite, and then the second one would just, he'd put it down and leave.
It's hard to say, like, I feel bad for a murderer, but the image that has stayed with me for many years when I was just doing research on this before I even had a podcast is him starving himself for days and then checking himself into the Sportsman's Lodge in Studio City with a box of fried chicken and just trying to get as much down as he could before the voices stormed in again. To me, that's an image suffused with so much pain that it complicates. Your thoughts about this guy?
Without going into some of the more sordid details that are in the book, that episode that you describe is minor compared to the torture that he would submit himself to in the coming years. He made his life into a complete horrible hellscape. He could barely bring himself to leave his apartment. When he did, he was overweight, disconnected, kind of scary, and you called him a murderer. I'm not sure that's a fair phrase for Jim. He was mentally ill, severely mentally ill, and what happened to his mother was a result of that. He didn't really kill his mother. He silenced his mother.
Right.
From his point of view, he had to. From his point of view, he was being tortured and tormented and beaten into the ground by this voice that he needed to silence, and was encouraged to by the voice in his head. You've got to kill me. So I sort of like try to avoid the term murderer. It's pejorative, to say the least. And Jim's gotten so little compassion because of the shocking nature of his crime. It hits us all in some very deep part of our psyche, the idea of matricide. It's so fundamentally psychologically violating. And people have this incredible emotional reaction to it. Like, he killed his mother, and it's just this horrible thing. They don't see the years that went behind that. They don't see the 15 hospital admissions. They don't see the intense struggle that this guy had to try and right his capsized ship and sail on into where he was going. To me, it's just one of the most horrifying possible stories that you could find. To be
one of the
driven mad from the point of view that he had, where he was really, as you say, on top of the world. And yet he couldn't enjoy it. He couldn't take satisfaction from it. He couldn't do anything. It was a struggle every step of the way.
What you just talked about is the very reason why I'm so excited to read your book, because it's something of a magic trick to change people's perspectives on somebody who kills their mother. You know, I mean, I'm a little bit of the way toward where you are. You're all the way through because you've talked to everybody involved and that kind of thing. Around this time, actually, it's kind of muddy for me. This part in your book, I'm very excited to read because not all the pictures are filled in for me. So
I'm going to fill them in for you.
The Spring 78 Jackson Browne tour. What happened there? Because I know that Jackson Browne was rooting for him, really wanted things to work out with Jim. He had to have known this guy is like severely troubled by this point.
He didn't.
He didn't. Okay.
No, Jackson's a fantastic guy. And he's one of the few people that put out a helping hand to Jim at a time when nobody else did. They brought him in to cut Here Comes Those Tears Again on The Pretender. And he was phenomenal.
Yeah.
Then Jackson went out and did the album that he recorded live, Running on Empty. And he recorded it and then put it out. And now he had to go out on tour again to promote that album. But his rhythm section had been booked by James Taylor. So he needed to put together a new rhythm section. He brought Bob Glaub in. Now, Bob Glaub had been on a session with Jim, and Jim had blown up at him. What are you doing? You're messing with my time. You know, it's just scary. But Jackson says to Bob, well, we got to get a drummer. And Bob said, you know, I don't think Jim Gordon's doing much. He's a little nuts, but there's nobody better. So they brought him in for a rehearsal, and Jim cooked, and David Lindley just fucking loved it. And they took him out. And at this point in Jim's life, he had experienced remission. He'd been attending a daily course in adult development at UCLA. He'd been under some serious treatment with a psychiatrist, and he was dialing in his meds. He was living in an apartment in Brentwood. He had a girlfriend. Things were going very well for him. Jackson had no idea that Jim had mental issues. He knew there had been some rehab, but he figured it was a drug and alcohol thing. That was all over the industry at the time, and he didn't see any reason to inquire. So he just looked at Jim point blank, and Jim was playing great. They ran together during the tour. Jim was on the good foot, started drinking again, and that, began to leak into the whole thing. But yeah, he completed 3 good little tours with Jackson in 78.
By all accounts, is he spot on?
Playing was great. He was not difficult to deal with. There were no incidents. He really kept it together. He didn't return to the fold either.
He didn't return to the fold because of his choice or Jackson?
I think Kunkel was back.
So really, the Jackson Browne tour is the last time that he's able to pull out the stops, right? Did Bob Dylan offer him a spot in the 1979 tour, the gospel tour?
Dylan called and wanted him to play, and the Voices wouldn't let him.
His mother specifically.
Mom was definitely down on the drums.
And then came Paul Anka.
Paul Anka episode where he called up Anka, and Anka sent him the book, and he went to Vegas and set up for the rehearsal and hit the drum once. And then the Voices took over, and he looked at the musical director and said, I can't do this, and flew home to Los Angeles before the show that night. That was the end of his career. There were a couple other bands that he played in, small-time things. I've got some demos if you want to hear them.
Yeah, I'd love.
But that was pretty much the end of Jim Gordon, the great session drummer.
So Lowell George, Thanks I'll Eat It Here, and the Muppets, did that come before the Paul Anka show?
Yeah, right around there.
Okay. So the Paul Anka thing is really, that last hit of the snare was kind of it. That was his take it easy.
Yeah, he was gone from the scene for quite a while after that. He met up with an old friend who convinced him to join a band. And they did a few gigs, did some rehearsals. But when it came time to cut the demos, Jim couldn't bring himself to do it. So that band ended. The friend put another band together and convinced Jim to try that one. That one, there are some demos from, and there were some gigs in Hollywood, but it fell apart too.
Any of this stuff remarkable in any way or no?
No.
Okay.
The third group was a bunch of younger guys that had a kind of R&B flavored band, maybe along the lines of Fabulous Thunderbirds, and they had a Monday night gig in Santa Monica. And Jim joined their band and was playing with them up until like just a few weeks before he killed his mother.
Okay. When is it? Is it 79 or 80 where he just, at some point he stops playing music and would go for weeks without bathing or shaving or changing his clothes, just watching old movies and writing songs he'd never finish? Around when is that happening?
Yeah. It was 79, 80, 81.
Okay.
82.
He spends like 4 years holding on for dear life, basically.
I don't think he could really function. I think he was bombarded by voices. I think his disease had reached a fever pitch, and some of the symptoms got completely dramatic, really controlling his life in ways that he just couldn't contain at all.
He thought that his mom wanted him dead because he no longer served a purpose in the world, right? He had done his job and it was time to leave now. And he thought his mom killed Karen Carpenter and Paul Lynde.
Yeah, she had some role in their deaths, apparently. She controlled all the doctors that he saw. So this is so twisted. But look, Dave, these voices are generated by his brain, right? So they know everything he's ever done, and they know every thought he's ever had. These voices are geared to drive him crazy, and there's no sympathy, there's no cessation. It's just full on. This force is always going on in his brain. It's hard to understand. I spent a lot of time writing the book talking to people who work in mental hospitals with schizophrenics, and it's an incredibly common disorder. 1 in 100 in the general population. By comparison, multiple sclerosis is 1 in 10,000. And if you wonder where all these people are, just drive around downtown Los Angeles and look under the freeway overpasses. They're sitting in tents there.
Yeah.
Jim could function on the level he did. It was astonishing to all the mental health professionals I talked to. They did not understand how he could have the condition he had and still manage to have a professional life that was as demanding and exacting as he did.
One of the sad ironies to me is that, from what I understand, he actually killed Osa because she was preparing to move to Portland, Oregon, and her being out of the picture in his mind would give her a more enhanced sense of control over his mind.
That's not what he said.
No.
He said he was happy she was moving.
Oh, okay.
He wanted her out of the way. She'd been living in Tahoe, and she'd moved back to Los Angeles, and he didn't dig that at all, but he didn't go see her. Talked to her on the phone a little, but he didn't have anything to do with her in real life. Yes, his mother wrote him a letter that he never opened. His brother wrote him a letter that he did read, and that's where he got the news that she was planning on moving. I don't think that bothered him at all. I think he was happy to get rid of her.
So at the time of the incident, he's in a band called I-5, was trying to get a record.
No, I-5 was 81, 82. It was over by then.
Okay.
I-5 was Jerry Sheff, Danny Timms, Larry Rolando, and a guy named Steve Moose wrote the songs and sang them. The Blue Monkeys were the band that he was in at the end.
The Blue Monkeys? What kind of music is that?
That's Pete Anderson, who would eventually be Dwight Yoakam's record producer. Rolly Sally, Chris Isaac's bass player eventually, and a guy named John Heron on keyboards and a saxophone player named Steve Allen. And they played in this Irish bar every week in Santa Monica.
Originals or no?
They weren't writers. They had friends that wrote songs, and they did some of those things. It was less serious before Jim. Then when Jim joined the band, they got a little bit more serious and started trying to develop some material, and they cut some demos.
So do you want to talk about June 3rd, 1983?
No, not particularly. Everybody knows what happened. It was a brutal crime, and Jim was arrested at around 6 in the morning, and he never left jail again. He spent 37 years in jail. He was 38 years old when he went in. That's half his life. His professional career lasted about 15 years, and it came to a sudden and complete end.
One of our listeners, Dennis O'Neill, who's a great guy, he asks, why did he refuse parole, and why didn't he participate in music while incarcerated?
He did a little, not much. He didn't want to be a drummer anymore. It was just, I mean, he'd given up his life. No, he didn't want out. I talked to people who were inside with Jim, and he was remote, cool, not a big presence on the yard, and spent a lot of time in his cell. It is typical of older schizophrenics that they become more withdrawn and more within themselves. Yeah, no, he didn't want parole. He didn't go to his parole meetings. He stopped doing his talk therapy when he was up for parole. No, he didn't want out.
I'll tell you, there's a lot of scary pictures of Jim because I have this thing about people that look different in every picture. There's something very off-putting to that for me. And Jim is that guy. Every picture, he looks very different. But the one of him in the courtroom, holy shit, man. He looks...
That Los Angeles Times photo with him with the beard and everything. Yeah, they don't have that. I've been trying to get a copy of that. I've also been trying to get a copy of their mugshot. And get this, the records were destroyed within 24 hours of his death. I mean, the penal authority in California is useless, inefficient, ridiculous. But they destroy the records for dead prisoners right now. His body wasn't even released.
That's crazy.
They destroyed the records. Jim's life is such a horrible tragedy. And the finale of Osa's death and his life in prison is just unthinkable. This guy had the most brilliant future anybody could have had. Married to his childhood sweetheart, making all this money, doing what he loved, and being at the top of the world, as you say. And yet he couldn't stay there. He couldn't hold on to it. He couldn't even slide down. He had to fall. And he fell as hard and far as anyone could.
There's only 2 or 3 stories in music history that are on the same level of tragedy. But, you know, what Jim has that a lot of other people, like, you know, there's other people who it's tragic, but they didn't have the talent. Jim was preternaturally talented.
He rewrote the book of drums. Yeah. And nobody plays drums the same way that they did before Jim Gordon. He added so much vocabulary and so much definition, and there isn't a drummer out there that isn't aware of his work and hasn't incorporated it.
And of course, he died just about a month ago at 77 years old on March 13th, 2023. While he was in jail, he attempted suicide a number of times, I believe. Still had the voices. I believe it was his brothers who became the main voice for him. And I think still harbored very distant hopes of playing with Eric Clapton again.
He would speak about that. He spoke about it with a Washington Post interviewer. Look, the guy was mentally ill. I have transcripts of interviews that he did in prison, and you read them and you have to really put a filter on so that you can receive what he's actually trying to say, because he's mentally ill. And his lucidity waxes and wanes, and his ideas of what he's trying to communicate are twisted and bent around. He's still mad at his mother in these interviews. He doesn't have any remorse over what he did, because to him, what he did saved his life. So try and put those pieces together so that you can see what his reality is. And it's a different world than the one you and I live in.
Well, I wrote a little eulogy here. I mean, one of the gifts that this show gives me is to be able to take in the entirety of somebody's work. You get to really feel the arc, the overview and shape of their arc in a way that even the artists themselves might not have understood. So I wrote a very short piece here. So tightly wound as a young one, it seems he would have had to work hard to keep that brand of lunacy at bay and away from the watchful eyes of the world. But keep it hid he did, until the drugs scratched that itch wide open, like a gaping wound that just would never close up anymore. The 70s were a staircase that led down for Jim, the 80s even more so. The scariest part of it is that his level of artistry was second to none. He was just the best of the best. And to think that he was able to eke out an existence in the high-stakes world of rock and roll in the 70s and hide amongst the day trippers is pretty scary. Most likely there's a Jim Gordon who's insinuated himself in amongst your life too, soldiers. It's just part of the territory these days. And frankly, I believe just as Osa Marie's existence deserves to be celebrated, so too do the lives of the sick and mentally unsound. Jim was a mortifying marvel. I'm glad the man is at rest now.
Yeah, well, the voices are gone, that's for sure. We got to feel good about him being free from that.
Yeah. Now, is the book coming out in February?
February.
I am ludicrously psyched about this book. I have a 4-year-old, so I don't get to read very much, but I think I'll put him up for adoption until I'm done reading it.
4-year-old. You got started late on that, didn't you?
I did. Yeah, I didn't find my wife till I was knocking on death's door. In all seriousness, we've had authors on the show and I've read their work, but I've read multiple books of yours. Joel is the real deal. If you haven't read his stuff, I can say for sure that the Altamont book, the Sly book, I'm sure the other books that I mentioned at the top of the show.
And then also, I would recommend to you the Burt Burns biography.
That's the next one?
Here Comes the Night. No, I published that in 2014.
You think that's the next one I should read based on?
Oh, yeah. If you're a fan, that's some of my very best work. It's an amazing story along the lines of Jim Gordon.
Yeah, I would love to read it because I wrote my essay to get into college on Astro Weeks and its importance in my life.
Well, you text me a mailing address and I'll stick one in the mail to you.
Thank you. I appreciate that. I'll get you back with something awesome, okay?
Not to worry. I appreciate your interest.
Joel, this has been awesome. This has been the fruition, actually, of a dream for me for many, many years. So thank you.
My pleasure, Dave. We'll be in touch.
All right, that about does it. Stay tuned because this Monday, March 11th, a bonus episode is dropping and it's a doozy. Kula Shakers, Crispy and Mills, and Paul Winterhart talk about the 15 albums that inspired them as a band, and it's truly a great list. And then next Friday, March 15th, brings upon us an exclusive interview with legendary art rock wildman Phil Manzanera, focusing on his early days in Roxy Music. Trust me, you're not going to want to miss it. A heartfelt Discograffiti thanks goes out to my beautiful wife and son, Jen and Mason. Joel Selvin, Diversion Books, the publisher of Selvin's forthcoming Drums and Demons, The Tragic Journey of Jim Gordon. My incredibly loyal fans, and especially the entire Patreon community, the Soldiers of Sound. I love every last one of you, and this show would not exist without you, my friends. Speaking of friends, it's high time for some new ones. They're in our Facebook group, Discograffiti Soldiers of Sound. That's the best way to find out what's coming up on the show, but there's a hell of a lot more. You get recaps of the day in music history, the ability to pitch questions to guests, polls that put you in the driver's seat on guest and band decisions, access to a thriving creative hub if you're looking for a collaborator, and much more. So make sure you don't miss out. You can find the link to the Discograffiti Soldiers of Sound Facebook page right there in the show notes. And if you don't mess with the Zuck, hey, no sweat. Just email me at info@discograffiti.com and I'll keep you in the loop. So now that it's done and you want more, another way to dive even deeper into the limitless wonders of skewed 1960s hippie living is to go straight to the beginning and listen to Pink Floyd, episodes 1 and 2, The Monkees, episodes 22 and 23, The Band, episodes 25 and 27, The Zombies, episodes 59 and 60, Sweetwater, episode 79, and Burt Summer, episodes 83 and 84. And of course, be sure to mark your calendars, because this Monday, March 11th, and Friday the 15th, we're coming at you with the greatest Briton of all time. That's Kula Shaker and Phil Manzanera. Trust me, you're not going to want to miss them. And so, from now till then, don't let our youth go to waste, lads and ladies. It's Discograffiti.
Osiris.